The Cape Smythe Whaling and Trading Station at Barrow was owned by H. Leib's Company, San Francisco fur dealers, and was managed by Charles Brower. The station had been set up so that Eskimos employed by the company could catch whales in the narrow leads in the ice in the spring, long before the whaling ships could make their way into the area. Brower had such an enormous stock of merchandise and provisions that the trading station could easily have been called the Emporium of the North. When notified of the wrecks to the south, Brower immediately took command, starting by sending the dog teams to help us. A better man could not have been found anywhere. He had been all over the world in deep water ships, so he knew ships and he knew sailors. I later learned that Brower was born in New York and had gone to sea when he was 13. When we arrived in Barrow, he was about 35 and had been in charge of the trading station for Leib's for 4 years. Before that, he worked for the Pacific Steam Whaling Company. But his life at Barrow was not always on land. At about the time the Belvedere, Orca, and Freeman were leaving Herschel Island, Charles Brower was having his own adventures with the Arctic. This was in August 1897. Brower wanted to get materials that had been shipped from San Francisco for construction of a branch of his trading station. He expected the materials to arrive with the first steamers to come through the ice. So in July, he took an Eskimo crew and an umiak, a sealskin-covered native boat, and went to meet the season's first steamers at Icy Cape. The first ship to arrive was the Navark. Its captain was Joseph Whiteside, who reported to Brower that the company had changed its plans and there would be no branch station. Brower was invited to go back to Barrow aboard the Navark, while the natives returned in their umiak. In the vicinity of Icy Cape, the Navark was surrounded by ice and could not get out. The ice was carrying her to the north. Finally, Barrow was sighted from the masthead. Brower knew the currents at Barrow better than any other white man. He suggested to Captain Whiteside that they abandon ship and try to reach Barrow over the ice. Brower knew that men on the ice would have a good chance of being seen from the shore, and he knew that there would be natives with umiaks who would go out to help the men. He also knew that if the Navark got into the terrific currents north of Barrow, the people aboard would have a mighty poor chance of saving their lives. The skipper said they would stay with the ship. Brower then asked if Whiteside would let him go by himself. The captain refused and said that he would shoot any man who left the ship without his permission, including Brower. The captain was afraid that if he let Brower go, some of the crew would want to go with him. It's a pity the captain didn't heed Brower's suggestion. Had he done so, it is likely that no lives would have been lost. The Navark continued to drift until she was quite a way to the north of Barrow. At last, the skipper decided to abandon ship, and they did, taking 2 whaleboats over the ice with them. They hadn't gone far before the boats had been stove in so badly that if the group had reached the open water, the boats would have been most unseaworthy. So everyone returned to the ship where a canvas canoe was built. Captain Whiteside and his wife, Chief Officer Blaine, and some of the men were to follow Brower and others who went on ahead over the ice to find a route for the canoe. Whiteside's group was to bring the food. 6 men remained aboard the ship, and do you know, those men said later that if there had been just one engineer among them who could have started that engine, the ship would have been saved. But there wasn't anyone who could. Whiteside decided not to follow the Brower group, and with the light boat and ample supplies got to safety in about a day. The followers of Brower had a terrible time. The chief engineer was an older man. One of the firemen, a native of California, stayed with him to try to help him. They got behind and were never heard of again. The steward of the ship told Brower that if Brower lived, to remember the steward to his sisters, whom he loved, and who lived in San Francisco. Shortly after that, a shot was heard. The steward had killed himself because he could go no farther. Finally, Brower and the men with him reached the open water. It was after nightfall, and they were quite a distance to the eastward of Point Barrow. They sat down to rest. Mike Scanlon, the first assistant engineer, was one of those fellows. He was strong and broad, nothing but sinew and muscle. He stood the trip fine up till that time. He sat down close to the edge of the water. Brower warned him that he was too close and that the ice might break. Scanlon didn't heed the warning. A few minutes later, the ice broke and rolled over, and they could hear Scanlon calling and calling for help until finally he was heard no more. They couldn't see him in the dark and probably couldn't have helped him even if they'd been able to see him. That was the end of one fine man. In my early sailing days, Scanlon and I had been shipmates in Pacific mail steamers running to Panama. Brower and the balance of the men got on a cake of ice in the hope that it would drift ashore. One day, finally, a ship was sighted. It turned out to be the steam whaler Thrasher, commanded by Captain Coggan. He had given orders to keep a sharp lookout from the crow's nest for the Navark and anything that could be seen on the ice. Finally, an Eskimo said, "Something out there." The men in the crow's nest with their powerful glasses were told from the deck to see what it was. They reported walrus, but the natives said, "No, him not walrus. I savvy walrus. Him men." The ship's course was immediately changed, and it headed for that black spot. It turned out to be Charles Brower and 15 followers. They had been on the ice for 12 days without food and were in the most awfully weakened condition. Some of them had eaten their boot tops, and I even heard that some of them had eaten part of their flannel shirts. They were hoisted aboard the Thrasher. The captain gave them each a little drink of whiskey and got them to bed. They weren't allowed much food. Men in that condition can't be given all the food they want, but just a little bit at a time. If I remember right, 2 of the men died soon afterward, and others suffered amputations. The men were distributed among 4 ships, and the Thrasher proceeded to Point Barrow, where Brower was put ashore. He was still recovering from the ordeal when I first met him. Brower took the responsibility for seeing that the crews of a lot of icebound ships had sufficient provisions. An inventory was taken of the food on the ships so that he would know what each ship had and what would be needed. There were the crews of the shipwrecked Orca and Freeman. The Belvedere had been forced to winter in the vicinity of the Seahorse Islands. The Newport and the Fearless had been caught in the ice and were wintering 38 miles east of Point Barrow at Cape Simpson. The Rosario and Jeannie also were caught. The Rosario close to the beach between Barrow and Point Barrow, and the Jeannie in a very dangerous position off Smith's Bay. Not one of them had planned to spend the winter in the north, and all of them would be out of provisions before the winter was over. Because the price of whalebone was very high at that time, Brower had a great number of Eskimo men in his employ. The Eskimos could catch whales in the spring when the bowheads were passing Barrow, resulting in a catch that could add considerably to the whalebone to be shipped south later in the year. That year, the caribou were very numerous around Barrow, so Brower fitted out his Eskimo hunters and sent them inland in different directions. It wasn't long before word came back to send teams out to haul in the carcasses of the caribou that had been killed by the Eskimos. Brower took charge of all the meat. Each mess was allowed so many pounds weekly. Now I'll tell about the housing arrangements of the shipwrecked crews during the first part of the winter. On a little hill just a short way south of the refuge station stood an old building that had formerly belonged to one of the whaling companies. In this building, bunks were built 3 tiers high, and nearly 80 men were sleeping and eating in this one house, which became known as the bunkhouse. Each man there was allowed a small loaf of bread every morning and evening. The bread was baked in the refuge station. Other food was cooked at the Presbyterian mission a quarter of a mile away and had to be carried to the bunkhouse. It was a very unhandy procedure, but it was the best that could be done at first. Later, a cook stove was installed in the bunkhouse. About 2/3 of the men living in the bunkhouse were white and the others colored. The whites had the northern end of the building and the colored men had the southern end. It was a terrible place for a big bunch of men to live. There were other places at Barrow where the men might have been housed, but no one had the authority to take those buildings over in the name of the government. When a captain puts his crew ashore and makes arrangements for their food and shelter, his responsibility for them ceases. The rest of the men from the Orca and Freeman lived in various places. Captain Porter and Captain Sherman had a little cottage close to the whaling station and dined with Charles Brower. A man named Ellis, who had been the first officer of the Orca, along with 2 of the Freeman's officers, was employed by Brower and lived at his station. The 4 engineers, 4 officers, Johnny the blacksmith, and old Captain Atkin, who had been in charge of the refuge station for years, were now guests in that old building. Our host, E.A. McIlhenny, was from a prominent family that manufactured Tabasco sauce in Louisiana. His 2 assistants were both zoologists, bright fellows and good company. There were 10 unexpected guests living in McIlhenny's house, and every 3rd week 3 or 4 of us ate at McIlhenny's table with him and his 2 assistants. Of course, he had his own private stores. The food was very good at his table. At the table where the rest of us dined, the food was not so good, but we did all right considering the conditions. There are always people who are not willing to leave good enough alone. Captain Atkin, Chief Denny, and Second Mate Ripley were continually harping on the food we got at the refuge station. They claimed that McIlhenny or his Japanese steward were taking the food sent weekly for our table and using it for themselves. The rest of us didn't agree with them, but these 3 kept on nagging. Finally, one morning, Mr. McRory, who had been chief engineer of the Orca and was a very nice man, said, "Very well, let's walk up to Brower's station, and you can tell him all you've been telling us. If it's true, I feel certain he will straighten it out." Atkin and Ripley said it was too cold out to walk anywhere, and Denny said he wasn't feeling good. But McRory got the 3 complainers and some witnesses over to Brower's station. Soon after, Brower visited our house and talked to McIlhenny. McIlhenny called his steward, Frank, who said he had given some of McIlhenny's food to the men at our table so we would have better food to eat. I am sure that was true. The result was that the practice of men taking turns eating at McIlhenny's table was discontinued. Brower allowed us a government ration, 1 pound of flour, and 1 pound of meat a day, along with whatever he could spare. That was the end of pleasant meals. But compared to the crewmen, we were living very well. The bunkhouse was in awful condition. If you happened to be passing there and the door was opened by someone going in or out, the smell would about knock you over. Much of the men's clothing was in bad shape. It seemed to me that they did not care how they looked, with their hair unkempt, faces and hands unwashed, and the skin clothing on some of them looked as if it was ready to fall to pieces. Just one visit to the bunkhouse would make you wonder how men could live in such filth without sickness and death. There was one heating stove there, but it was impossible for that to heat the whole house. Most of the men had seal oil lamps made out of fruit or tomato tins. These they put in their bunks to help keep warm. If you don't know how to take care of homemade seal oil lamps, they will smoke and throw off a very disagreeable odor. The problem was made worse by the fact that there was scarcely any ventilation. The house would sweat. The steam would freeze so that around the walls inside the house, near the floor, there would be a foot of ice, which in no way helped to keep the place warm. Probably it was just as well, however, for if the bunkhouse had been warm, there might have been sickness. Most everyone of the men wanted to keep himself and his clothing clean, I'm sure, and would have if he could. But with just one stove, and that used for part of the cooking, it was impossible for that many men to melt enough snow or ice for water to wash their hands and face, let alone their clothes. So they just had to let themselves go. Many of the men tried to keep themselves physically fit by taking walks when the weather would permit. Others would get out of their bunks only when compelled to. One way all of us kept fit was by hauling ice for water. The freshwater ice pond was located probably 1.5 miles from the refuge station. In the fall, when ice froze about 8 or 9 inches thick, men went down there to cut ice into 2 by 3 foot blocks, haul it out of the pond and stand it on edge, and when the snow came, haul it to where they lived. The ice was put on an ice rack built 3 feet above the ground so that the ice could keep clean. The officers and engineers had to cut what we thought would be enough ice to last all winter for our mess and McIlhenny's also. We had a large sled, and to this sled was fastened a long lead line. Each man attached the line to his harness to the lead line so that he could pull. We would haul 2 loads every day the weather permitted so as to have some ahead for the stormy days to come. All in our bunch seemed to enjoy bringing home the ice. Besides being good exercise, it was one way to pass the time during a very long winter. As soon as things were reasonably organized for all the men at Barrow, it was decided to send word to the big outside so the rest of the world would know that we were safe. Brower, Captain Porter, and Captain Sherman decided to send Bigfoot Tilton, who would go by a route nobody had ever taken before. At times, he and his dog team would have to live on what he was able to shoot. Bigfoot was a big man with a lot of courage, and we all knew that he could get through when no one else could. McIlhenny decided that he too would send a man on this errand, but his man would go by way of Herschel Island, then up the Mackenzie, stopping at a chain of Hudson Bay Company's trading posts, all the way to Edmonton, Alberta. McIlhenny asked me if I would make the trip. I would have liked to, but I was inexperienced in handling a dog team and knew nothing about the trail. Instead, Charlie Walker, who had done a lot of traveling, was chosen. McIlhenny bought 9 of the best dogs and the best sled that could be had. He also hired 2 natives to accompany Walker to Herschel Island to hunt seal or caribou for dog feed. Plenty of food was provided for Walker and the natives. In addition, Walker had a silk tent and a Primus stove, just the things for the trail. McIlhenny wanted his man to get there first. He told Walker that he had far the better and shorter route and ought to get outside easily a month ahead of Bigfoot, and that was true. Walker left in the morning and got as far as Point Barrow. Next morning, McIlhenny got a note from Walker saying that he would have to have 2 more dogs. McIlhenny bought them, sent them the same day, and urged Walker to lose no more time. The next we heard was that Walker had reached either the Newport or Fearless, had remained there 4 or 5 days, then gone on to the Genie for a few days more. At last he got to Herschel Island. To light his Primus stove, he needed a tablespoon of alcohol to prime it. Walker had a quart when he left Barrow, but on reaching Herschel Island it was all gone. So he went to the assistant missionary and hoodwinked him out of 2 gallons of pure alcohol. And that night there was a big party at Herschel Island. According to the report, the 2 natives brought back Walker remained at Herschel Island about 2 weeks. Anyway, he finally reached Shingle Point at the mouth of the Mackenzie. There he met Mr. Stringer, a minister to the Church of England. Mr. Stringer knew all about Walker and wrote a letter to the man in charge of the Hudson Bay's post at Fort McPherson, Mr. Firth, telling him to not let Walker delay a moment and to inform all the rest of the posts that it was very important that Walker make the fastest possible time. Bigfoot Tilton and Charlie Walker reached San Francisco within 3 days of each other. I've forgotten who was first. Walker should have been ahead by a month at least, for he had an easy route and a trail that had been used often. Bigfoot went via Wainwright, Point Hope, Kotzebue, past Nome, and down the Alaska Peninsula. He rowed alone to Kodiak Island in an old codfisher's dory and managed to find a steamer that took him outside. A big fuss was made about the two men when they arrived in San Francisco, and a lot of friends and relatives were glad to learn that all those crews were alive and getting along all right in Barrow.